All right, our first lesson that we're going to go through is the economies of both the North and the South at this time. One thing that a lot of people have noted as something that they know about the Civil War is that it's kind of split into like a North versus South. Remember, anytime you're talking about like a civil war, you're talking about people fighting amongst themselves. And that's ultimately what we're looking at here. So the first thing we're going to look at is one reason why there was this divide is the difference in the economies and the way they were set up and the difference and how that kind of divided things into the North and the South. So I'm going to go through the PowerPoint here. At the end, there will be kind of one question for you to answer. So we'll go through kind of this PowerPoint here, and then you guys will have a chance to answer that question at the end, and that will be it for our first lesson. All right, so a couple things for you guys to pay attention to at the beginning here. There's some vocabulary that I'm going to have you take a look at. The first one there, discrimination. I'll use my pointer here. So discrimination, Eli Whitney, he was a famous inventor who helped to make the cotton gin. So he's one that we're going to want to pay attention to. The Cotton Kingdom, this is the area in the South that was really heavily relied on making cotton. They had plantations that stretched from South Carolina through Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. Remember, this kind of ties into the Trail of Tears and the government taking over the Cherokee land. The cotton gin, this kind of ties into Eli Whitney there. He was the guy that created the cotton gin. It really was what led to the expansion of cotton within the South area. And then cash crop. A cash crop is to sell a crop for profit instead of being used by the grower. So a lot of times farming at this time was just people that were growing their own crops to be used, but cotton was one of the first major cash crops, and it was used by farmers to sell to make a profit. So those are a couple of vocab words that you are going to want to pay attention to as we go along. So as you see, kind of the area of the North that we're going to talk about, the states this time, it kind of goes into the Virginia area and upwards into the Northeast. And so we're going to start with looking at the North. So the North, a couple things to pay attention to is that North was very much dominated by industry. So businesses, factories, although most people lived on farm, the economy and the way people made their money was through manufacturing and trade. With the invention of new machines, everything from making clothing to harvesting grain took less time. And that's really what led to the development of the North, is the ability of technology to make stuff faster, from clothing to a lot of stuff in farming. As new technology was coming out, that really made the North economy expand because there was more money, because you could make stuff cheaper and make stuff faster. So things like Morse code, the telegraph is another example of just how things were developing during this time. And it provided merchants and farmers valuable pricing and supply information. So that was one of the early uses of the telegram, was farmers were able to send information about their supplies and businesses and just kind of be able to communicate that way. So a couple of things here. That increase in manufacturing goods led to quicker ways to develop and transport goods. Specifically, roads, canals, and railroads helped boost the economy. As more ways were developed to transport goods, you could get stuff faster to different places. You could just produce things at a lot quicker rate, and that really, really helped to expand things in the North. Now, one big change that came is in the 1830s, factories began to use steam power instead of water. So that steam was able to provide more power. And what this allowed is, rather than relying on like a river with fast moving water, factories could be built anywhere. And that's really what led, factories might have been in big cities along waterways. Well, now you could build a factory in other places that didn't have these rivers because they were built on steam. And that allowed the Northern American industry to expand to other cities and really, really led to the strengthening of the North. And along with that, as that technology started to improve, stuff could be made cheaper. That's one thing that was really, really important. As the cost of products went down, more access to them by people. People had money that they were able to spend on goods because stuff was being able to be made cheaper. So now, if you look here, this map that we have shown is some of the transporting, different ways to transport items. So improvements to the railroad system made trains a reliable source. And you really notice here the difference between the north and the south. If I could draw a pencil with a pencil, a line right here through like Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, you notice a lot of red lines up here at the top that just indicate how easily it was to transport goods in the north versus in the south. There are still, quite a few railways in that area, but not nearly the railway system that you would see in the northern half. You also see this one red line. That's the Transcontinental Railroad that was able to move people out to the west, went to California, but it also helped people that were going to the Oregon or Washington territory. They were able to do that as well. And railroads really allows factories to transport large amounts of raw materials and goods very cheap and very quick. Super important. All right, they were able to transport goods very cheaply. Now, this also led to many northern families left their farms to take jobs in factories and as sale clerks. As the economy of the north starts to go more towards industry, that's where the money is. People started off probably a lot of farmers, but they couldn't make large amounts of money farming because you couldn't grow enough crops to be able to sell. You were just growing crops, basically for you to use. And so so many people are switching to industry because that's where the money is. People were getting paid decent wages to work in factories, and that's what happened in the north at this time. Now, I specifically want to focus on one group. We have African Americans. So slavery, in the early years of the United States, slavery was legal in the North. We know that. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, there was nothing mentioned about slavery in either of those. So slavery was legal everywhere to start, but that is going to change as things go along. By the early 1800s, all the northern states had outlawed slavery. Many thousands of free African American citizens lived in the North. So just because you were an African American living in the United States at this time does not mean you're automatically a slave. There were many, many thousands of free African Americans that lived in the North. The problem with that is a lot of them faced discrimination. You guys should know discrimination is when you treat people not fair just based on, a certain specific characteristic. In this case, the color of their skin is what led them to that discrimination. And it was very difficult for even, skilled African American workers to find a job in the North. If they were very qualified to do a job and were hired, a lot of times the white people that were working in those businesses basically walked out because they didn't want to work next to African Americans. So it was really hard for African Americans to find good jobs at that time because that was just the way things were. So this graph really demonstrates how many free African Americans were living. So 1790s, when our country was first started, you can see kind of in the north and the south how many free African Americans there were, all the way, for the next, about 8 decades there. These are how many free African Americans there were in both the north and the south at that time. So like I said, just because, you were an African American does not automatically mean that you were a slave. There were still ways to, purchase your slavery or buy your freedom, I should say, that a lot of people took advantage of. There's a few success stories of African Americans during this time. Just kind of keep these guys in mind as we get to the third part of this Civil War unit. We're going to talk about famous individuals. Just a few to point out. Henry Blair invented a corn planter and a cottonseed planter. Able to, again, the technology there allowed for those things to be done quicker. William Whipper, he grew wealthy as the owner of a lumber yard, and he used his wealth to help save slaves and help them purchase their freedom. Macon Allen became the first African American to practice law in the United States. And then John Russwurm became one of the editors of the Freedom's Journal, the first African American newspaper. So there were some really big success stories with African Americans, despite the obstacles and the discrimination that they face. So really cool stories there. Now, switching gears, we're going to look at the South and what they kind of had going for them. So you again can kind of see the area that's circled here. We're looking at like the Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia area, and further south. So the big thing in the South, cotton drives everything. So unlike the North, which became more industrial with machines and factories, the South became more agriculture. So textile mills in the North and in Britain, they were making clothes at a record pace. Cotton was in high demand, and no matter how much cotton was needed, it's such a long and tedious process to be able to get cotton that they really struggled to keep up. So they could not meet the demand, even though the weather was perfect for growing plenty of cotton. They had to pick out the small cotton seeds by hand, and that was a really slow process. So that was usually where African Americans, they were working in cotton fields. People who were slaves were picking the cotton seeds by hand, and that was just a long process, and it took a long time. And so farmers couldn't get it cleaned fast enough to keep up with the demand that was needed. So this is where Eli Whitney comes in. He's a school teacher his name was Eli Whitney, and he saw the struggles that people faced. So in 10 days, he decided to come up with a cotton engine, also known as the gin, that used 2 rollers and thin wire teeth to separate the seeds from the fibers. You can kind of see it here. They turn this crank, they feed the cotton through, and it pulls the seeds right out of the cotton. That was huge. They could make or clean the cotton about 50 times faster. One person could do the work of 50 people cleaning the cotton by hand. The cotton gin quickly became the most important invention in the United States at that time. So they could now keep up with that demand, and the demand for cotton was even going to expand further. So you can kind of see this map shows you just how, popular or how important the cotton farming was. So it kind of stretched in there. This is called the King Cotton. So the cotton gin allowed farmers to grow more cotton. Farmers grew 6,000 bales of cotton a year. By 1850, farmers grew over 2 million. So from 6,000 to 2 million is how much cotton jumped during this time. And so with that, they began to look for more fertile land to grow. This is where we talked about the land in Georgia that the Cherokee had. That's part of the reason why the Trail of Tears happened, is they wanted this land in Georgia because it's right in the heart of cotton country. So they were also known as the Cotton Kingdom. So this area in yellow, Cotton Kingdom. Now, there's a cycle here that you'll see. So the slaves work hard, the planters make more money, and then that money is turned around and used to buy more land. So the more money they make, the more land they buy. When they buy more land, guess what happens? They need more slaves. They needed people to be able to work on their farms, and purchasing slaves was the easiest way and the cheapest way for them to be able to do it. So that the more money they made, the more land they bought, the more slaves they felt they needed. And so that was kind of the cycle that happened here for farmers in the South. Now, cotton wasn't the only thing that was being grown in the South. This is a good map to kind of look at the resources that were being grown. So green here is the cotton, but in the more of the Midwest area, you see more of your corn and wheat, which hasn't changed a lot. The North, more dairy and cattle. These red things are textiles, places where their cotton is sent, and the little smokestack, other manufacturing. The little orange dots are places where slaves revolted against their owners. Varying degrees of success. We're actually going to look at a few cases of some slave revolts, and so this gives you an idea of kind of where everybody as a country kind of stood, what they were known for: cotton, corn and wheat, dairy cattle. You have some tobacco areas as well. So kind of a good map for you guys to look at and to study. Now, the one term to remember here is that cash crop. That's that crops that you basically grow to sell, not necessarily to use for yourself. And cotton was the biggest cash crop that there was at this time. So, although the South was mainly agricultural, there was some successful industries, people who made railroad equipment, machinery and tools in Richmond, Virginia. Flour mills were also common factors in the South. That's really kind of the extent of like the industry in the South. And the South really trailed behind the North in manufacturing. That's going to play a huge role in the actual Civil War itself, is that the North was able to manufacture goods at such a high rate that's kind of one of the reasons why the North was able to win the Civil War. Yeah, this is a good one as well. This is kind of a good example of why, even though so much money was being made off of cotton, it wasn't really helping the South as a whole. So slaves were not paid for their labor. So they're the ones doing all the working. So this meant millions of slaves living in the South had no money to buy any goods or services. That also meant, because they had no money, that there was no demand for goods. So as people who were trying to sell stuff, it was harder to sell stuff in the South because most people, or a large percentage of the population, had no money to buy anything with. So slaves had no money, couldn't buy anything, the demand wasn't high. So that really hurt the South's economy. They couldn't produce as much money because people couldn't buy as much stuff. Okay, the South was also very dependent on the North. They didn't have as many manufacturers. They became more and more dependent on the North and Europe. So most manufactured goods like furniture, farm tools, and machinery were purchased from the North. So northern factories were making all the items for the South. Some southern farmers even borrowed money from more northern banks. And it's super important, like we talked about. All this stuff that we've been talking about really is one of the biggest reasons why our nation went to war. The North versus the South, the difference in, the economies there and what each of them produced really makes a huge difference. Kind of the few final points here. When the Southern agricultural way of life was threatened, both the North and the South will rise up and fight for their cause. So each of them kind of doubles down. The North says, you know what? Slavery's bad. We know it's bad. We don't think you guys should have slavery. The South says, hey, we need slavery because we're so dependent on those people to work, and we feel like it is important to our economy will collapse. And so as kind of tensions rise here, both the North and the South really kind of dig their heels in on different sides of slavery. So this is kind of the flip side, the northern economies. So as more people started to work in factories, they were paid for their work, but because more people had money, that also meant the demand for goods in the North was increasing, and that's how more money was made in the northern economy. More people had jobs, more people had money, so there was a higher demand for goods, and more money was going around. This last one is just kind of the map of where everybody stood at this time. So the 3630 line is the one that we talked about previously. That's this line that kind of goes through the states here. So any state in blue has outlawed slavery. The states in red are pro-slavery. And then the ones in the yellow, they're a little bit different. It kind of depends on which one. Popular sovereignty is a term we're going to talk about, and you'll see as we get a little bit further into this unit where those states stood. So that's kind of the end of this first lesson. It's a chance for you to just kind of understand, each side of this is what the North has, this is what the South has, and why that led to such a big difference and why ultimately it contributed to the Civil War. All right, for you guys, next up, you need to go to Schoology and you need to answer one of the discussion questions. So I'll see if it's working here. So under causes of the Civil War economies, you guys need to answer the question here of name one strength of the North economy and one strength of the South economy. So that's the one thing I need you to do before we have class on Wednesday. That's all I have for you guys. Thanks for watching this first video. We'll see you again in class.